Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu in Washington with a look at our latest polling from Bloomberg and Morning Consult, the final one we will see of this election, which is now just 12 days away, of our poll in the battleground stage, which, as we've mentioned, shows that this is a dead heat, not just statistically speaking within a margin of error. It is literally a tie, 49-49, Trump-Harris. When you look at the state-by-state breakdown, Joe, you do see there are some standouts. Harris, for example, is up by a little over 3 points in Michigan, by 1.7 in Pennsylvania. But in some of these states, like another blue wall state, Wisconsin, Trump up by 0.3 percentage points.
It's a 3/10 race.
This is literally a coin flip.
Well, yeah, and I'll remind everyone that we've been doing this poll for a year now. Yeah. This is an October to October story. So when we talk to Eli Yokley in a second, keep in mind we have a year's worth of data. Of course, Kamala Harris has only been at the top of the ticket for a small period of this time. But some of the consistencies that we've seen with Donald Trump are remarkable, with a floor of 47% and a ceiling of 49%, consistently for a year, no matter the legal headlines or any of the other noise around this race. He's also continuing to lead on the economy here, Kailey. That's a sticky number, 5 points on the most important issue in this race.
Yep. Again, 50% say they trust Trump more to handle the economy. Though when you look at the breakdown of economic issues, while Trump is trusted more on things like interest rates and the cost of everyday goods and gas prices, battleground voters do trust Harris more on housing and healthcare costs, and she has been able to close the gap on taxes. So there have been areas in which she has made gains, but to your point, it's not necessarily enough to overtake Trump on this number one issue.
Sure. When it comes to overall, who do you trust on the economy, and specifically, who do you trust to manage prices? Eli Yokley has been our partner in this project for the last year, Morning Consult politics analyst, and joins us right now, a year later, with the October numbers. Eli, speak to the consistency, if you would, the stickiness of these numbers for both candidates, specifically, though, for Donald Trump, who seems to have the same exact base now than he did 1 year ago.
Yeah, this race has not moved much. There's just not that many undecided voters in this contest. We've been watching this at the national level, and for 11 days, we got the exact same reading every single day on where this election is. Kamala Harris, in a way that Joe Biden wasn't able to, was able to bring along that 2020 Democratic coalition to match the level of support Donald Trump has with that same group. The next 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, is going to be about trying to expand that. This survey is among likely voters. I think Trump's campaign has been pushing very hard to try to reach out to some of those voters on the fringes who may not think they're likely to vote today. And that's where the battle is going to be over the next 12 days.
Well, and as we consider the messaging over the next 12 days, Eli, I do wonder what the data suggests about what the most effective messaging to win over that very small basket of voters actually will be. When we look at this poll, yes, by wide margins, Harris is found to be more mentally fit by battleground voters, 47 to 33% for Trump. She's seen as more honest by a margin of 10 points. She's seen as compassionate by a margin of 16. Donald Trump, 48% said is dangerous compared to just 35% who said the same for Harris. So as she makes the case here about his unfitness for office, as we mentioned, calling him a fascist yesterday in her town hall on CNN, is that the kind of language that is ultimately going to make the difference? Because all that said about how voters feel about Trump from a personality standpoint, if you will, he's still tied with her across these states.
Yeah. The dangerous message does meet the electorate where it is. About half of voters in these swing states see Trump as dangerous. And, if you look at the kind of voters who are supporting Kamala Harris's bid, they are less likely than Donald Trump's backers to say their vote is a vote for their candidate. They're more likely to say it's a vote against Trump. And these voters in the middle, the independent voters, the kinds of folks who are more likely to be undecided still, in Kamala Harris's camp, the independent voters supporting Kamala Harris are far more likely to be negatively motivated. And so those kinds of messages seem aimed at that chunk of the electorate. It's policy versus personality. And in the last few weeks, when you're running against Donald Trump, that personality argument carries a lot of weight.
I'm struck by this plurality of swing state voters, likely voters, believe that Kamala Harris will win the election, even though we have a tied number here. This is fascinating to me, Eli, the prospect of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We hear a lot about voters who like to try to pick a winner. Does this advantage Kamala Harris?
It shows energy. I mean, this is one metric of where the momentum is in the campaign, but this number's pretty close too. 45% think she'll win, 41% think Trump will win in the swing states. She has a bit of a energy advantage on this question over Donald Trump, but not by much. I would just point out that this kind of goes against some of the online hand-wringing among the left. Voters in these key states see a lot of energy behind Kamala Harris, and they think she has an advantage, those supporting her, but it's matched by those backing Donald Trump. There's not a lot of people on either side of the aisle who think the other party is going to win.
Well, and as we consider how difficult it's going to be to figure out who wins if the margins is this tight, preparing our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio for this to take a while to figure out, Eli, it also kind of raises the question as we consider what voters' expectations are of the massive breakdowns we are seeing across demographics, specifically how much more likely it is for women to support Harris and men to support Trump. Can you just walk through the kind of breakdowns across demographics you're looking at, not just by gender, but race as well across these 7 states?
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris is doing a very good job among women voters. She's doing well among Black voters. There seems to be a bit of attrition, at least compared to 2020, among the youngest voters. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing Kamala Harris try to lean into in this final couple weeks of the campaign. Campaigning with Beyonce, for example, it seems like outreach to young folks, sending Barack Obama out to talk to young Black men, a group that among all young men is slipping a bit for the Democratic Party, and trying to get folks back where they would be expected to be in this campaign. This last part of this election, though, I mean, I don't want to say the cliche of the election cycle every single year, but it does all come down to turnout here, right? Like who shows up to vote matters. That's what these last 2 weeks are about in this campaign.
It's never meant more. And as we keep saying, who scores last? Kailey mentioned Kamala Harris up by 3+ in Michigan. Noteworthy here, Donald Trump's best showing in this poll is in North Carolina, up 1.2%. I take that back. In Georgia, 1.5. But I want to ask you about North Carolina specifically, Eli, because there's been quite a bit that's gone on there to disrupt the flow here, not the least of which has been the scandal surrounding the Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, but also the impact of Hurricane Helene that has caused many people to worry about the very thing you just mentioned, turnout. Could we find ourselves with a very different result in North Carolina because of those factors?
I mean, I think we're seeing folks show up to vote in pretty large numbers in North Carolina already. I think the Mark Robinson issue probably it benefits Democrats to some extent. There's less of a on-the-ground movement for Republicans sort of to try to lift up Donald Trump. But, I mean, we're seeing the Trump campaign put a lot of energy into that state, spending a lot of time there. And, Donald Trump doesn't want to lose North Carolina. Losing North Carolina would make some of these blue wall states matter much less for Kamala Harris. If she was able to pull off a victory down in the South, some of these states like Wisconsin, which is tied, might not matter as much if she can pull off a victory down there. So I think that's why Donald Trump is spending so much energy there.
Well, and as we consider where Trump and Harris are spending their energy tomorrow, Eli, you already mentioned her appearing alongside Beyonce in Houston, but the point of her being in Texas, which is a state that will go for Trump in all likelihood, is to talk about specifically reproductive rights and abortion. This idea of that being something that can resonate nationally, even if she goes to Texas to talk about it. How are we seeing that kind of resonance across these states in the Sun Belt and in the Rust Belt, and as she makes that one of the elements of her closing arguments of this campaign?
Yeah, I mean, it matters a lot, especially for women. I mean, we're seeing some sort of a divide among women without children versus women with children in this survey. Clearly, those without children are thinking about this abortion issue in a way that maybe others aren't. Texas is also home to a Senate race that is maybe not the most competitive Senate race historically, if you look at the trends in Texas, but it's a close contest. I mean, Ted Cruz is one of the least popular senators in the country, and his Democratic challenger, Colin Allred, is pulling neck and neck with him down there. And so I think it serves two purposes. One is to help maybe try to boost up the Democratic Senate candidate there, and then to elevate this message about abortion nationally. I mean, you don't have to go somewhere for voters to hear what you're saying in the nature of the online campaign that we're living in. I mean, Donald Trump's going to New York to host a big rally at Madison Square Garden, for example. It seems counterintuitive, but on the other hand, I mean, that stuff can still break through, even if he's not in some of these key states.
All right, Eli Yokley, U.S. politics analyst at Morning Consult, our partner on this swing state poll.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome to the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. You made it to Little Friday. Thanks for joining us on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and we'll meet you in the studio. Always keeping our live stream active from Washington to New York as we follow the candidates on the trail here. Thursday, it's the 24th of October. We're getting pretty close. And not a shock to see Donald Trump in Tempe, Arizona, or Kamala Harris in the state of Georgia. She'll be in Clarkston later for a big old bash. You see the lineup on this thing? They're adding more people by the minute, it seems. We told you Barack Obama was going to be there. Also, a guy named Bruce Springsteen. Samuel L. Jackson added to the rundown here. Tyler Perry we knew about. Spike Lee. And is this the Beyonce one, James? There's one. Okay, so tomorrow we get the Beyonce. They're bringing out the big guns, much like we are here on Balance of Power. She's been at it for over a year. The boss of the poll, the Bloomberg Swing State poll, in conjunction with Morning Consult, there's one person in the newsroom who's had steam coming out of her ears for this whole process, and that's Wendy Benjaminson. She's with us back at the table here, Washington senior editor. Congratulations on a year of polls. We lived through a year.
Thank you. We did it.
What did we find over the course of this year? This is really interesting to not only look at the snapshot, but look back at the trajectory of this campaign, which you're going to help us do right now. The fact of the matter is, the headline is this couldn't be closer, right? This race is tied in all the states that matter.
Yes, and when we say tied, sometimes we'll say there's a 3 or 4 point difference, but it's within the margin of error. This is tied. This is 49-49.
There you go.
And in the individual states, it varies from 0.5 percentage points to 3.1 in Michigan, advantage Harris in that case.
Right.
But that's still within the margin of error. So, who knows? 50-50.
A 1% margin of error is about as low as they get.
It is.
Which this poll carries. This is a big sample.
Yes.
And so we can walk through some of the states. If you're with us on YouTube, you can see some of the charts here. You mentioned Michigan. This is the biggest gap we have at 3.1% advantage Harris. We don't have to go through the whole horse race here, but in a world where Harris picks up Michigan with a 3% advantage, that's pretty close to shutting things down, isn't it?
It's close. But then there's Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, as Hillary Clinton learned in 2016.
Right.
And at least Harris is giving more attention to those states than Clinton did. So we'll see what happens there. 3.1 is still within the margin of error, and that is still a very, very tight race. And we are seeing, she was counting on Arab Americans and Muslim voters to side with her over Trump, largely over Israel and over his immigration stances and things like that. But I've been seeing more reporting that Arab Americans and Muslims are not seeing her step away from Biden or step away, more pointedly, from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, enough, and may be leaning toward Trump which would really surprise me, and we'll find out in the exit polls. But Michigan is just another ball that's up for grabs.
And of course, whether you're talking Michigan or Pennsylvania, any of these blue wall states, the economy is going to be so important, any of the swing states. And you have found that Donald Trump still kind of owns this issue after all of the stuff that both campaigns have thrown against the wall in the last year.
Yeah. Now, Trump talks about the economy a lot. Harris was for a while. When she first got in the race, she came up with the caring economy and the opportunity economy, and she started talking about housing costs and healthcare costs. And her numbers went up. She has been on this closing argument that Trump is awful, that Trump is a fascist, that Trump is a threat to democracy, and all these things. He is still talking about the economy. And the race, as I've said, is very, very, very tight. Yeah. But in our poll, what is so amazing is that Democrats have used this argument that Trump is awful for 9 years. And it had failed miserably in 2016. It worked a little bit in 2020. I mean, Biden won, but still, they were still making this argument. And they're back to that argument now in the closing weeks. And our poll showed that voters know that. We asked about character traits, and by large margins, I mean 10 points in some cases, swing state voters say they believe he is dishonest. He is not compassionate. He doesn't care about people like them. He's too old. He's not mentally fit. She leads him on all those categories. And yet that's the man they want to steer the U.S. economy. And so if I'm looking at those numbers and if I worked for Kamala Harris, I would be saying, how about we talk about the economy? Because democracy is the fourth most important issue to voters. It is the economy at 36%. The next nearest one is immigration at 15%. And then it drops further to abortion rights and then democracy. So maybe if it's that close, talk more about the economy.
Take a hint?
Yeah.
This is the Take a Hint poll. Wendy, lastly, remarkable to see something else incredibly consistent for Donald Trump. That is his floor and his ceiling. They talk about, Fibonacci's when it comes to the stock market. He stays right in that channel.
He does.
No matter what happens.
Yeah, this poll has shown the most static electorate I think I've ever seen. Nothing changes. The man can say the most awful things. Twice people can try to shoot him. You'd think that would make his numbers rise up. That doesn't. Nothing he says seems to move the ball. And he just has the same number of people. Now, this is what Harris is trying to do now, is to try to get those Republicans who aren't crazy about him, especially Republican women, to come out and vote, to not just say, well, a pox on both their houses, I'm not going to vote. And the gender gap is tremendous. I mean, women really don't like Donald Trump, a large number of them. And if all of them go out to vote, more than sort of the young bros that Trump is trying to energize, who don't vote in his large numbers, then maybe she can pull it out. But
a lot more to find in the story itself, on the terminal and online. 2 weeks out, Trump and Harris locked in a dead heat with the help of Wendy Benjaminson. Find our poll now a year in with an enormous amount of data to sift through if you're interested in where this race is going. Wendy, thank you so much for all of your great work on the poll and helping us cover this campaign. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington, and glad you're with us if you're just joining us on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power. Wendy said something important. After the economy, it's immigration. So how about we just take these two issues here and walk them into our next conversation, because this is something very important here that Melissa Morales has been following here as founder and president of Somos Votantes and Somos PAC, and both campaigns, of course, targeting the Latino vote, and through different visions and different messaging when it comes to the issue of the economy and the issue of border security and immigration. Melissa, thanks for joining us. It's great to see you. Welcome back. Are the campaigns doing anything to expand their bases, to actually draw new Latino voters into their fold?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here and to talk about my favorite topic, which is Latino voters and where are they at and what are they doing right now. As you said, I lead a set of organizations called Somos Votantes and Somos PAC, which run some of the largest Latino civic and voter engagement programs in the country. And recognizing the essential role that the economy holds as a key issue for our Latino community. 3 years ago, I began partnering with the Winning Jobs Narrative Project, which has been this 3-year-long economic research project focused on how to better connect with people on the issue of the economy. So when we think about is either campaign doing anything to really broaden their basis, this issue of the economy really becomes key. Core to the Winning Jobs Narrative Project is the belief that working people, including hardworking Latinos, are the engines of the American economy. They're the true heroes of our economic story. That's how they should be centered, not just in the economic policies that we're talking about, but in the economic messaging as well. And 3 years worth of research from the Winning Jobs Narrative Project shows that that's the framing that really resonates with voters. It moves voters. And in regards to Latino voters, it's what they want to see in closing arguments down the stretch. In the past month alone, Somos has talked to over 170,000 Latino voters across the country. And the question in Latino voters' minds, for a lot of them even still, is who can provide a clearly communicated vision for the economy, and how do I specifically fit into that vision? So we've heard a lot of that from Kamala Harris. We've heard concepts of those plans from Donald Trump, but how those economic policies are communicated down the stretch in this final 2 weeks is going to be very important.
Well, we're talking about the largest racial or ethnic minority in the country here. And so you have people like me going on the air asking questions about something called the Latino vote. And I know that you're entertaining my questions here, and I really appreciate that, Melissa. But the fact of the matter is, you've been on the ground, I understand, in a number of states around the country talking firsthand with voters: Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania. The Latino vote is not a monolith. You're talking about a lot of different people who grew up in different circumstances and have different ideas about what the economy means to them, what conservative means, the role that religion plays in their lives. So take us to school on the groups that we should be paying attention to.
Yes, I think what's really interesting is, that we hear this a lot, that Latino voters are not a monolith. You have pockets of voters in different states. Latino voters in Nevada look a lot different than Latino voters in Pennsylvania. But at the end of the day, the through line here with Latino voters is really this concept of the economy and what it means for them, which is, can I afford to take care of my family at the end of the day? And what does our future look like economically in this country? And that includes a lot of the things that we've heard Vice President Harris talk about. Can we provide the tools and opportunities that Latino families need to build a good life for themselves and their family? That's the small business loan she's talked about. A big thing we have heard from voters is about home ownership. I think in polling, you sort of get this static answer. What do people care about? We've heard housing costs, and in our minds, that translates often to rent, which is certainly true. People think that rent is high, but the real question underlying that is that Latino voters feel like they work very hard. They want to own a home someday. And right now that dream feels very out of reach. So can someone speak to that, which we have seen Vice President Harris do a lot down the stretch. So when we think about the economy, both the vision for the economy that Kamala Harris has set out, the vision for the economy that Donald Trump has set out, where Latino voters really converge is in this, is either side talking about the tools and opportunities that my family needs to be able to build a good life. And that's foundational, no matter what group of Latinos that you're talking about.
Well, we've got our new Bloomberg News swing state poll out today, Melissa, and it zeroes in not only on the horse race in the swing states, but issues as well. And this is still Donald Trump's to lose on the economy based on what we've seen now for an entire year of monthly polling in partnership with Morning Consult. 50% of swing state likely voters say they trust Donald Trump more to handle the economy. 45% say so for Harris. If the economy is the number one issue in the Latino household, isn't that advantage Trump?
So a couple of things that I would say on that. And one is that when we look at polls of likely voters, we are missing an entire segment of the electorate, and especially the Latino electorate, of voters who may be unlikely to turn out. But that's exactly what Somos is working to do right now, is to turn out those more unlikely voters. I think we want to be able to look at the whole here. And the second is that I will see you a poll and I will raise you a poll, which is that, I think, yes, definitely, In the past, Donald Trump, the Republicans have had this advantage on the economy specifically. Eki's research released a poll yesterday, which shows that while the top line show a very stable race for the Latino community in particular in a Trump versus Harris matchup, where we have seen movement is this undercurrent of who people trust more on the economy. And we have actually seen Vice President Harris take the lead in this latest poll on who Latino voters trust more on the economy. And if I was Vice President Harris, that's certainly a dynamic I would be holding on to and optimistic about headed into Election Day.
It sounds like you might agree with the analysis we just had from Wendy Benjaminson. And yeah, in our final week and change, spend time talking about the economy as opposed to a threat to democracy. Do you see it that way?
You know, I think when we think about things like a threat to democracy or reproductive rights, other things we have seen Vice President Harris spend time on, I think those things go hand in hand with the economy. You know, we cannot have a stable economy, either domestically or globally, without a stable democracy in the United States. So those two things really go hand in hand. So I think we can focus on more than one thing at the same time. And in the sort of global economy we live in the economy across states, you know, interstate economy that we live in, a stable democracy and a stable economy go hand in hand.
Melissa, it's good to see you. Thanks for being part of our conversation and bringing your work at Somos Votantes and Somos PAC to us here on Bloomberg. Melissa Morales, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Much more ahead.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
With 12 days to go here until the election, coming off of what was supposed to be the final presidential debate. Wouldn't that have been something last night to have Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on a stage together? Donald Trump did not agree to the debate or the venue, which was CNN, so it became a town hall and another free hour of airtime, in this case, for Kamala Harris. They talked about a lot, but as we consider the closing arguments from both candidates, we spoke earlier about Tucker Carlson last evening, Daddy's home in Georgia. That was happening while Kamala Harris was crystallizing her closing argument, coming off of the rhetoric that we heard yesterday about Donald Trump as a fascist, remembering that General John Kelly did a couple of interviews to that extent, talking about Trump as a threat to democracy. She was asked about it by Anderson Cooper. Let's listen.
General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
So for more on this element of Harris's closing argument in a race that our new Bloomberg Morning Consult polling in the battleground states is literally a dead heat, we turn to Jim Messina. He is chairman of the Democracy Defenders PAC, also founder and CEO of the Messina Group, and of course was a campaign manager for Barack Obama. He is in our New York headquarters. Jim, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We've seen Kamala Harris leaning more and more on this messaging that Trump is unfit to serve, a fascist, as she said she agreed could be described of him that way last night, that he is a danger to democracy. Frankly, she's sounding a lot like Joe Biden. Is that a mistake?
No, I think she crystallized her closing message last night when she said Donald Trump has an enemies list and I have a to-do list for the American people. And that's going to be the contrast. When I ran President Obama's campaign, Kailey, I used to say to him, we need it to be a very clear choice. And that's the choice that she is attempting to drive here in the final days of this election.
Jim, it's good to see you at World Headquarters in New York. Thanks again for joining us. That is an interesting and crystallized campaign message. The Trump campaign has an answer. Kamala Harris broke it. Trump will fix it. You, as a practitioner here, I know you're wearing your Democratic hat, can say what about both? Contrast these two closing arguments for us.
Well, look, I think both of them are attempting to figure out the theory of the case of this election. And what you realize is these swing voters, Joe, that you and I and Kailey have talked about so many times before, think about politics 4 minutes a week. They have an average of 2.5 jobs. They're busy and have their life in front of them. And it really is about them. It's not about politicians. It's not about what they want. It is about what these voters want, and they want a better life. And the candidate who taps into that in these final days is going to win this election.
Well, when we consider what a better life means, perhaps that also means better opportunities or better situations economically. At least that's what our polling suggests. The economy is still the number one issue, and across the battleground states, Donald Trump is still trusted more on it. They've both outlined their economic plans, but is he spending enough time talking about hers and the contrast between them? Would that be a better way to spend the next 12 days?
Well, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You have to do both. And in your morning consult poll, I think the number that really stood out to me is they're basically tied on taxes, and they're now tied on who's looking out for you. And that's a key metric, because you're right. He has this advantage on the economy that is kind of stabilizing his campaign. If she can get even with him, if she can start to catch up, and there's some evidence in the battleground states that it's closing, then she'll be really well off. But if he wins this election, it's because he'll win on the economy.
What do you make of the use of celebrity here in the next couple of days and the week or so? Jim Messina, you know a lot about this. I was at your convention. You had the Foo Fighters on stage. You had Mary J. Blige. This is Bruce Springsteen. We're adding Beyonce to the list here. Does it start to cloud the message? I remember Rick Davis's ad, the McCain campaign, running the celebrity ad against Barack Obama in the first campaign. He obviously still won, but there is a point of diminishing returns here, is there not?
I don't think so, Joe, and here's why. I think what we all can agree on is the American public is over this election and kind of sick of the candidates and the negative ads. And
so may as well have a concert.
Well, and bringing some celebrities into it shows you in a different light. Having Beyonce show up is helpful. It'll turn people out. You know, Trump's looking for his stuff. Eminem introduced Barack Obama the other night. Two things I never thought we'd say together. But the truth is that in the waning days, you want to continue to make it exciting. You want to show momentum. And I think celebrity really plays into that.
Well, as we consider the other people that are factors in this race beyond the candidates for president themselves, there's obviously their surrogates. There's also other people who are running in these states at the same time they are, including in Senate races. And when you look at the latest data out of some of these Senate polls in the swing states, Tammy Baldwin in a tie in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in a toss-up, according to Cook Political Report, in Pennsylvania. When you look at that kind of data, Jim, about how tight these other races are in these states, what does it make you think about the presidential campaign?
That it's tied as well. Pretty much, you know, in these battleground presidential states, the Senate races tend to kind of rise and fall with the presidential campaign, with the exception of Nevada, which seems to have its own sort of difference where the Democrat in the Senate is pulling away, whereas Harris is struggling in Nevada. In the other states, you know, the Democrat is performing pretty near Harris, and it's a reminder that people are much more ticket voting than they used to be. There used to be these mythical swing voters, and there's just not anymore. And it's why both sides want their presidential campaign to overperform.
Well, Jim, we've got 12 days, as we've mentioned.
Thank God,
What would be your advice? Yeah, well, I don't. That still feels a little long to me, to be honest. Kamala Harris is going to be on the ellipse on Tuesday, talking about threats to democracy, trying to conjure the images, and she'll be able to do that with the optics there, but also the emotions, the feelings of January 6th. That could be a lasting tone that she sets here in what will be the final week of the campaign. What would be your advice to her and the campaign at large as they deal with the potency of January 6th?
I would be careful not to overplay it. I wouldn't make it all doom and gloom. It needs to be a contrast. And a contrast to that moment, January 6th, with the violence and the anger, you know, allow a little bit of hope, allow a little bit of this is us. This is our side. We're different. We will bring stability. But I think to your point, Joe, it is an incredibly important moment. She's only been in this race 92 days, and there still is this thing called the commander-in-chief test. Voters want to see her be presidential, and I think it's a brilliant move to go there, and now she needs to deliver a strong performance, look at the country and say, hey, watch me. I can be your leader. I can do this job. And I think it's a very smart move, but it's a very high stakes move as well, and it'll come just days before the election.
It's Jim Messina. He's chair of Democracy Defenders PAC, founder, CEO, the Messina Group, former Obama campaign manager. Give our regards when you walk through the pantry, Jim. It's great to have you at World Headquarters in New York. As we consider this important moment now on the campaign, we add another voice. Peter Wunsch, live from the IMF meetings here in Washington, D.C., and governor of the National Bank of Belgium, European Central Bank Governing Council member, with a very different point of view on things. Mr. Wunsch, welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio, and thank you for joining us from the IMF. We're only a couple of days out, as we've been mentioning here, 12 days from the U.S. election taking place. Is that the main topic of conversation where you are?
It is certainly an important topic of conversation, and we, of course, look a lot at what's taking place in the U.S. At the same time, we've had discussions more specifically on, inflation and where the European economy is going. But the two might be related going forward.
Well, and as we look going forward, we have a central bank decision here in the U.S. just 2 days after the election. You yourself and your colleagues at the ECB will have one coming up as well. The market thinks in December there is a rate cut baked in, that there is a chance for a half-point move. Can you rule out 50 basis points? What would you need to see to make a cut of that size?
Yeah, of course, it's a question I've been getting a lot recently. I don't think really that's the discussion today. I know some of my colleagues are already discussing cutting 50 basis points in December. We'll have 2 more readings of inflation before we have new projections. My take on it is, of course, the European economy is weaker than we thought, and we had an inflation surprise on the downside in September. But I think, honestly, talking about a 50 basis point cut in December is premature. We are data dependent, so I really want to see the data. We don't know as of yet whether this weak number on inflation in September is a blip. We had a forecast with basically inflation going back to around 2.5 at the end of the year. It might be lower, and it might mean that we have to remove restriction faster. But I don't see why we should today have a discussion on a 50 basis point cut in December. I think really it's premature.
Governor Wunsch, I wonder the extent to which geopolitical risk is clouding your ability to forecast. We talk about, of course, the war in Ukraine here every day, also an escalating conflict throughout the Middle East. Is geopolitical risk a greater level of uncertainty than the U.S. election?
Well, I think it's a combination of the two, of course. Depending on who's going to win the election in the US, you might have discussions about tariffs, which could impact the world economy and the European economy. We had at some point some tensions on the oil prices, and then it abated. It could go up again. So, of course, that's part of the reason why it's a difficult environment to navigate. But also, more broadly speaking, I mean, I've said before, what we have under control is not under control, and what we don't have under control is under control, by which I mean domestic inflation in Europe is still very high, and it's because imported inflation is low that we see inflation going on average towards 2%. But it also means that you still have tensions on both directions. So you have imported inflation below target, you have domestic inflation above target, and a few changes here and there on oil prices, on tariff, can make it move in one or the other direction. And indeed, the number we got in September was more in the direction of lower inflation, but we still need more information to be sure that we are landing to this target.
So you've told us 2 things, Governor, that the European economy is weaker than you thought, but that domestic inflation also is still very high. When we look at the picture holistically, and not just how monetary policy factors in, but fiscal policy as well, which in many European countries is tightening, do you see forces at work in which there could be a further weakening of the domestic European economies, and then potentially undershoot of inflation?
I think the risks are still relatively balanced, and with the number we've had in September and also the PNI, maybe they've been moving a little bit more on the downside. But I would not over-dramatize inflation falling to 1.8% or 1.7%, honestly. We've been way above 2% for a while. And to the extent that it would be imported inflation, which is low, that's a completely different scenario than inflation, domestic inflation being close to or below target, which is not the case today. So again, it's part of the picture. It's part of what we are going to look at when deciding on further cuts. I guess directionally, we can start removing and maybe even accelerate removing the restrictive monetary policy we had. But I would not make a bet in terms of the speed at which we will get there as of now.
All right, Governor, we appreciate you joining us today on Bloomberg, live from the IMF World Bank meetings here in Washington, D.C. That was Pierre Wunsch, Governor of the National Bank of Belgium and member of the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. We appreciate your time, sir, as we have an eye abroad and at home, and how many of these issues, Joe, intersect as we talk about the economic picture around the world. Monetary policymakers, fiscal policymakers, rather, having to factor in a U.S. election, which could have major implications for inflation, for growth, and relationships between the U.S. and other countries around the world.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where with 12 days to go in an election we've spent well over a year and a half talking about, we once again are bringing you the latest on this race in its final stretches. As we have done over the course of this entire cycle, our job here is to bring you the facts as they are, the reality of what these campaigns are doing. Not to sanitize anything, just to present the information as we see it and to get the smart analysis from professionals that provide our audience the context and information they need. It's not always comfortable. Certainly, Joe, we have had to deal with some uncomfortable subjects here on Balance of Power during this cycle, but we present reality as it is, including what went down in Georgia last night when Donald Trump was joined by Tucker Carlson.
How did we wind up with a system where Kamala Harris, you couldn't change the tire on your truck, much less drive it? How did she wind up at the top of the pyramid? If you allow your hormone-addled 15-year-old daughter to slam the door of her bedroom and give you the finger, you're gonna get more of it. And those kids are gonna wind up in rehab. It's not good for you, and it's not good for them. No. There has to be a point at which dad comes home. And when dad gets home, you know what he says? You've been a bad girl. You've been a bad little girl, and you're getting a vigorous spanking right now. And no, it's not gonna hurt me more than it hurts you. No, it's not.
We could keep that going, by the way. It got a lot more pronounced, and repeated references to girls. He of course, has, I believe, children of both gender, but kept referring to how the girl needs a spanking. This got the crowd chanting, "Dad is home," when Donald Trump finally came out. And we want to get a sense, if this is in fact the closing argument for the campaign, what it means for the election. And our political panel is back with us now. Jeanne Zaino, Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor, and political science professor at Iona University, alongside Maura, Gillespie, Republican strategist, Bluestack strategist, a veteran of the John Boehner Speaker's office. Great to see both of you here. Maura, I'll start with you as the Republican. The concerns that Donald Trump has struggled to expand his base and has found himself with a real deficit when it comes to women, leads itself to last night's rhetoric in what way?
So if you want to really double down on the fact that you've got a problem with women, what better way than to have Tucker Carlson espouse such a misogynistic, cringy, creepy diatribe there about spanking women? I mean, honestly, it just, I'm cringing still having heard it again. And Tucker Carlson being one of your final voices in this campaign couldn't be a worse message to send to the country as a whole, because Tucker Carlson takes great pride in having lied to his viewers for years and continues to do so on any platform he gets a chance to use. And I think what's important to remember here is that Donald Trump adores Tucker Carlson because of that reason, because he's able to make money off of lying to the people who trust him. And yet that's going to be somebody that Donald Trump has said that he would bring around him. He could very well get a cabinet position in the White House should Trump win. And so really diving in there and doubling down on your problem with women by having Tucker Carlson speak in this manner, is just, it's disgusting, to be honest. And it's not something that Republicans down ballot should in any way associate with, should really separate themselves from, because it is not something that we should be proud of in any shape or form.
Well, of course, we do have to say here that Tucker Carlson isn't running for president. Donald Trump is, Jeanne, and he may not have tried to distance himself from this language, or we may be able to look back at his being found liable for sexual abuse in the E. Jean Carroll case, back to the Access Hollywood tapes that came out in the 2016 election, yet he won in 2016. Yet we see in our battleground polling again that he still has solid support, between 47 and 49%, consistent for the last year. And it raises the question if any of this language actually matters.
It matters. I don't think it matters in terms of moving people away from Donald Trump that have long supported him, and that's why we always talk about his ceiling. And the fact is that this is language that people like Tucker Carlson and people on the Trump side believe is going to be useful for them in driving out the vote with the young men and men who are very hard to get out to vote in the same numbers as women. So it's gotten them enormous amounts of attention in the last 24 hours. And so that's the context in which they're doing it. They too see the gender divide that the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll and all the other poll shows. And I would just also say that, Tucker Carlson was saying this in the context of doling out punishment to Democrats and members of the media. And this is a theme that's been running through Donald Trump's campaign: retribution against those who are opposed to him, revenge. And that is what we are hearing and seeing. And Kailey, I have to add, you missed Joe Matthew's rendition of it earlier on the previous hours.
Oh, God.
That was something to behold. And Maura and I sat through that.
I feel like I should
endured
regret
it.
that and apologize for it. But look, there are questions about, and I'm not seeking equivalencies here, there are questions about the effectiveness of both campaigns' closing arguments. Kamala Harris is talking about fascism last night in her CNN town hall, following, of course, the revelations from General John Kelly in two separate interviews yesterday. Let's go back to the town hall on CNN last evening. Here's the vice president.
General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
Jeanne, Kamala Harris is down 5 points in our new Bloomberg News swing state poll out today when it comes to the economy. Is that what she has to train her attention on, as opposed to going back to what was a Joe Biden refrain, that Donald Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy?
She should be talking about the economy, but the numbers that they're looking at in the campaign are numbers which show, for this very small sliver of moderates who are still labeling themselves as undecided, it is this argument that moved them by 14% in some of this internal polling. And that is the argument that we can't trust Donald Trump. He is unfit to serve. And in fact, most effective, not from Kamala Harris, but people like John Kelly, people like Liz Cheney. That's why we just saw, I think, a $370 million ad buy on the part of the Harris campaign for the swing states, focusing on this very issue. So while the economy is number one in most people's mind, we're in such a close race that they practically need to be going to people's doors and walking them to the polls. And these people they're trying to reach who aren't voting early and haven't decided. These are the people who they think they can move. And so it's that argument, and it's reproductive health 1 and 2 with those folks.
Well, and we know reproductive health is what Harris will be focusing on when she is in Texas tomorrow with Beyonce in Houston, focusing on abortion. At this time, though, she is still in Pennsylvania. She's taking questions from the press right now. We'll, of course, bring you any news from her if we get it. Maura, as we consider what Jeanne was just talking about, this idea that she's trying to bring moderate Republicans onto her side, you probably would classify in that camp. And I just wonder if the job she's doing may be effective at convincing those people not to vote for Trump, but not necessarily to go out and vote for her. Isn't there a difference there? Is she doing a good enough job of trying to convince people why she should get their vote?
There is a difference, but there's only so much that she can do. She can't really, I think as a candidate who's running for the office, who wants to win this election, she should try to get those voters to vote for her. I, as a moderate Republican, am happy to say to my fellow Republicans, you don't have to vote for Donald Trump to stay a Republican. You can vote down ballot. And I think that message of why he is unfit to serve and why it's so important not to vote for him for president, I'm not telling anyone they have to go vote for Kamala Harris, because maybe they don't feel strongly enough to go do that. Maybe they don't feel as though they trust her entirely either. But there's a write-in option. But simply, too, with some of these Republicans, by not voting for Donald Trump, there is a net benefit. Because if we want to have a government that works across the aisle, that finds common ground to get things done, then I think the best case scenario of doing that is by making sure the House is led by Speaker Mike Johnson, making sure the Senate is led by John Thune, and moving the ball forward by working together towards where more things are in the middle. I think most of the country is. And I think that by pointing out that Trump has time and time again shown us that he is not only unfit to serve mentally, physically, but he just is not there. Again, he's about 80 years old. And if you had complaints and concerns about Joe Biden being too old for this job, then you cannot sit there and say that Donald Trump is, raring to go, when that's just not the case. And these comments, these, adoration for dictators, all the things that Kamala Harris is pointing out is helpful. And I do think it is effective because it's a reminder of what could potentially be entering the White House again in just a matter of months.
Jeanne, Fox News is reporting now that the Trump campaign has settled on its closing argument, its closing mantra. You can fit it on a bumper sticker. Harris broke it, Trump will fix it. Effective?
Yeah, I think that is effective because, what is it they need to do? It's the same thing Kamala Harris is doing. He needs to focus attention on Kamala Harris, tie her to Joe Biden and say, you broke the economy. Look at the inflation. Look at costs of housing. Look at everything like that, energy. You don't want to redo this again. She can't even get up in that town hall and say what she would do differently. So you should have me come back and fix it. That's a good closing message for him. But I am very suspicious he will be disciplined enough to stick to it. And by the way, it's the same thing that Kamala Harris is doing. He's unfit. He's going to take away your freedom to choose and your freedom to have the health care you and your doctor think is best. And so you should stick with the safe choice as with me. And that's because we have people that are trying to now get people out to vote, and nothing gets people out to vote like these kinds of negative messages scaring people about what's to come if their opponent wins.
All right, Jeanne Zaino, Democratic strategist and Bloomberg politics contributor, alongside Maura Gillespie, a Republican strategist at Bluestack Strategies. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.